All right, so on the introductions part, that's kind of what this page does. So I manage Westport Commons Farm for Cultivate Kansas City. We're right here at the site of the old Westport Middle School. And it's basically the playing field for the middle school, which presented some challenges for growing because it was graded to have the water run off so that the field would dry. And so that took a lot of the organic matter and left behind clay. It's also on a rock shelf. So on one end of the field, it's maybe 9 inches deep, you hit solid rock. And on the other end, it's, maybe 9 feet deep, you hit solid rock. So I also manage, or I'm on the board of Manheim Park Community Garden. I do some work as an environmental consultant. I'm a herpetologist. I do landscape design and all kinds of other things. So yeah, that's me. So I'm not sure if you wanted me to talk specifically about Westport, but I kind of do a general spiel on the type of soil stuff that I work on. So I'm just going to do my general spiel, and we can talk more specifically about Westport if you want to. But there's 2 questions I want you to think about when we're going through this, and one of them is, why did the Egyptians build the pyramids in such a shitty place? So usually I do these things live, so it's kind of hard to ask that question. Does anybody know why the Egyptians built their pyramids in such a dry place? Maybe you can raise your hand or something, or send it to me on the chat. Yeah, it's not as fun when you don't have people who can shout it out. So the answer to that question is that it wasn't a dry desert when they were planting it. So it was one of the most fertile places on the planet, subtropical, almost like a rainforest, very, very productive part of the world. And we made it, humans turned it into a desert through our farming practices. So, and there's mounting evidence that shows that the entire Sahara Desert may have been created through human farming practices in the last 6,000 years. So that's an area about equal to North America. And the reason I bring that up is because farmers are, they have the power to either create another Sahara Desert out of North America or to turn things around and actually make the world a better place and ensure the future of humanity, depending on the type of farming practices that they use. Obviously, that's not as key if you're growing on a ½ acre or an acre of land as it is if you're working on large scale, many hundreds or thousands of acres. But a key point to remember is that even organic farming destroys the soil through various practices that we use commonly that we accept as normal. And even organic farming will eventually lead to the desertification of the places that we farm if we don't, change some of the methods that we use. So, and then the second thing is when you're driving down the road and you see like a big tree growing on the side of Gillum Parkway, which I'm looking at right here, or an oak forest, when you think about it, when you drive past a cornfield and they're putting down 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 50 pounds of phosphorus, and 50 pounds of potassium in order to bring in that corn crop. And then you see this huge forest full of oak trees growing. Who's fertilizing those oak trees? And if we can think about those 2 things, I think it'll make a lot more sense what I'm talking about. So the answer is the soil food web, which I think, Carrie touched on some of this a little bit. I came in a little bit late because I was in a staff meeting there, but that's what we're going to be talking about, is the relationship between the microbiome and the soil and how plants get nutrients through those interactions. So starting at the beginning, dirt versus soil. So dirt, I think of dirt as all of the components that make soil. So clay, sand, organic matter, any kind of particles, rocks, things that are on the ground that you're walking on. They're like a substrate. And soil is more like an ecosystem. So these 2 pictures are sort of a depiction of that. When you're growing in just dirt that is inert and it doesn't have the microbiome intact, it's a lot like growing in hydroponics. You basically, your roots are rooting into basically an inert substrate, and you're feeding the plant everything that it needs through the inputs that you bring, so the fertilizers, Whereas in an ecosystem like a forest, you have cycling of nutrients that move from organism to organism. And those organisms are taking up things, and then they're dying or they're being preyed upon. And those nutrients are constantly cycling through things. And so on our farms, we can mimic the way that these nutrients cycle if we understand how it works. And I'm just going to give you a basic rundown of stuff that, you know, you probably should have learned in grade school. Maybe you didn't, whatever. But we all, it's so weird doing this on a computer. It's like the first time I've done like one of these talks on a Zoom. It's kind of strange. So, so we always think of plants as taking things from the soil, so sucking things up, right? That's why we have to fertilize. We're constantly putting things on the soil to feed plants because they need things to be fed to them, right? The reality of that situation and the answer to your question of who fertilizes these trees is that it's actually the other way around in a natural system where the soil is intact. The plant itself is a solar panel, and it's taking the sun's rays and it's taking carbon from the atmosphere and nutrients that it pulls up from the soil, and it's mashing those together and it's making sugars through photosynthesis, right? So the plants are making food to feed themselves and create their leaves and their stems and all the things that they need. But sometimes up to 80% of that sugar that the plant makes, it doesn't need it for its own body, and it actually just drips it out of its roots through this stuff called root exudates. And it's basically just sugars that the plant makes that's dripping out of its roots. For years, people weren't sure exactly what they were doing, that, you know, maybe they just have excess, whatever. Well, as it turns out, the plants are doing that intentionally to feed the microbiome in the rhizosphere, around the root zone, okay? And the reason why they do that becomes evident when you start understanding the relationships between those things. But the two main reasons are, one, when bacteria and fungus come up into the root zone and feed on those root exudates, at the same time, they are creating a habitat that they can live in, okay? So bacteria will take a little bit of sand, a little bit of soil, you know, a little bit of clay, a little organic matter, and they glue it together and make these tiny little micro aggregates that help them have a perfect little environment to live in that's humid and nice. And then the root hairs of the plants and the fungal hyphae and all these different things will come together using all these different types of biological glues. The most popular one that everybody always mentions is glomalin, and takes all of those particles and glues them together into these aggregations that make up soil. So soil is literally the leftovers of biological actions of bacteria, fungus, and plants interacting that creates this matrix that is healthy soil. And if you see healthy soil with good root or with good soil aggregates, it looks a lot like soil that's just been tilled. It's kind of crumbly. It looks almost like, a lot of people describe it as black cottage cheese or like chocolate cake. And if you grab it and you squeeze it in your hands and make it as tight as you can, it'll make a nice ball, but then it'll crumble back apart again. So through the interactions of the plant, the bacteria, the fungus, those critters are making perfect soil for them to live in, which also happens to be the perfect environment for plants for lots of different reasons. One of those being that the soil will soak up water very quickly. It increases water infiltration into the soil. The water is held in the soil for longer periods of time to keep it nice and moist so that plants can access it, and then obviously the microbiome can access it. And then the second huge interaction that happens in that relationship, and this is the part that blew my mind the first time I heard it, is that in your soil, there's like 1 million years worth of all of the organic, you know, molecules that a plant would ever need to grow and produce food for us. So, you know, if you want nitrogen, there's nitrogen in the sand and the soil and the clay and all the things around us all the time. There's potassium, there's micronutrients, everything the plant needs, with rare exception, is there in the soil. It's just not always available in a water-soluble form that the plant can extract it from the soil. For the most part, plants can't take inorganically available molecules and make them organically available. There are exceptions. Buckwheat is able to uptake phosphorus, is one good example. But our friends, the bacteria and the fungus, are capable of doing this, okay? So what they can do is they can take some inorganically available nitrogen, for example, or phosphorus or potassium or whatever, you know, any other of the 50 things that plants need to grow, and uptake that into their bodies, integrate it into their system, and make it organically available, okay? Now the plant, I used to say at this point in this conversation that plants can't take the nutrients directly from the bodies of the bacteria, but that's actually not true. Now we understand that plants can actually suck bacteria into their roots and tear them apart and spit out their their bacterial DNA again and use them directly. But aside from that, once that inorganically available molecule is made organically available in the body of that bacteria or that fungus, now it has entered that nutrient cycling system that I was talking about. So imagine a bacteria, it takes a little bit of nitrogen up from the soil that the plant can't access, and then it swims up to the, to the edge of the roots of the plant to feed on root exudates, and then maybe a bacterial predator like an amoeba or something like that, or a protozoan eats it. Then it's digested, then that drops its, micro poop. And now suddenly that inorganically available nitrogen is organically available. So through the microbiome, through a healthy microbiome, which includes all those microorganisms we've been talking about, as Carrie was mentioning, microarthropods, macroarthropods, everything all the way up the food chain. Worms are a huge key in that process. Once they start feeding on each other and interacting, they cycle those inorganically available nutrients directly to the plant, okay? So another thing that's really cool is the plants can actually ask for specific nutrients that they need by releasing certain types of root exudates, okay? So when a plant releases a particular type of root exudate, it might attract a particular type of organism, and that particular type of organism may be rich in a particular type of nutrient, right? And studies have shown that this can happen in real time, like as little as 6 seconds between the time when the plant releases that root exudate. It can be fed whatever specific thing it needs directly from that microbiome. And I'm sure you've all seen stories or listened to the Radiolab and these sorts of things about how the trees can cycle nutrients back and forth to each other using those fungal hyphae networks, and how they'll, for example, they'll put a radioactive nitrogen that they can trace into one tree and they'll find it in another tree like a mile away. So underground in that intact system, there's water and nutrients and everything that these plants need is cycling back and forth through this living, breathing organism that is the soil, which I would say is probably, it's not probably, it is our most important resource in the entire history of humanity. Without it, we don't have food. Food comes from farms. Farms are made of soil. So if we don't have soil, we don't have food. So maybe I should look at my notes here and not just talk. Oh yeah, soil food web. So here's a picture of all that I was just talking about. So, so you have your nematodes, you have worms, you have all these things. Worms, people are always talking about how worms are so great for the soil. One of the reasons why worms are so great for the soil is they don't actually eat organic matter as much as they eat these microorganisms. They feed on bacteria. So if you take a worm farm and you put just plain white paper on it, that plain white paper might not have very much nutrient quality to it, but once the worms poop it out, suddenly it's really nutrient rich. Like, how do they take something that's not nutrient rich and make it nutrient rich? And the answer is that they're digesting bacteria and releasing nutrients from that into the soil for your plants to eat. And worm poop, I'm sure everybody's heard, is fantastic for your plants. And that's the reason why. It's because it's directly feeding and cycling nutrients from these other critters. So yeah, there's that pretty picture. It's got me in it too. All right. So modern farming, one of the reasons why you can't grow corn just using the soil food web is that everything we do in our modern farming practices kills the soil food web. So in inorganic farming, when you spray antifungals, you kill the fungus in the soil, okay, directly. When you put down inorganic forms of fertilizers, a lot of those are very salty, and those will actually kill fungus and bacteria. When you till the soil, you expose bacteria and fungus to the air, you kill them, right? So the basis of that whole system falls apart through tillage and additives that we spray onto the soil. And therefore we have to grow in dirt and feed the plants everything they need. I have no idea how much time I have, so when I start running out, just give me some kind of sign here. So if we want to harness the power of the soil food web, there are things that we can do in order to make that work for us, no matter how big of a farm or how small of a farm we have. once you've accepted that this is a way that plants can be fed, and you know, I'd add something to this too. When you're talking about like doing soil tests, which I'm 100% for, I'm not trying to say anything negative about it. And you're saying, hey, we need to test our soil so that we know exactly how much nutrient we need to put down of this type to make our plants healthy. Okay. And we're trying to take the role that, that nature has created through evolution, you know, and this isn't a hippy dippy idea. I'm just saying, I'm trying to calibrate the exact amount of available nitrogen that a plant needs based off of scientific research that's done by, you know, humans who make mistakes and do things like that. And so like in modern agriculture, they'll spray 200 pounds per acre of nitrogen on the soil in some inorganic form or some water soluble form. And then 80% of it floats away into the water downstream and ends up killing the oceans, right? But the plants know exactly how much nitrogen they need. And individual plants and individual species of plants have different needs for every one of those different types of nutrients and micronutrients that they need. And as we've just learned, they can ask for it if they need it, right? So one of the real like advantages to utilizing this as a tool in your growing is that a tree that is growing you apples in healthy soil is going to be able to ask for the exact amount of nutrient that it needs from the soil microbiome and then express itself in the most perfect way possible, meaning that your fruit is going to be more flavorful. It's going to have more nutrients that might be good for you. Like when someone says an apple a day keeps the doctor away, at some point in history, that probably was true. Like when you had really healthy apple trees, I mean, this is you know, everybody understands this. If you go in your backyard and you pick a tomato that you grew, it always tastes better than the one that you buy at the grocery store. And there's a million different reasons for that. One of them is that those plants that are growing in your backyard are getting, you know, more specific care. They're interacting with, you know, the organisms in your backyard, and they're bringing up nutrients from the compost and the things that you're feeding to them. So your food could taste better, your plants could grow better, and they get to select on their own the types of nutrients that they need at any given time in the cycle they're growing in. I hope that wasn't too confusing. So one of the things we can do is stop tilling. And I know, you know, this is a hard one. Me, when I first started growing, I learned what they call the French intensive method or the deep bed method from a book that was written in the 70s. And I was all about double digging and, you know, getting my fork down there and breaking up the tillage, you know, digging up the soil and burying organic matter underneath the soil. And it works. I mean, it really does work. And all of these methods that we've been talking about, modern farming, it works, it grows food. But the funny thing is that once you start harnessing this ability to use the soil food web, you can plant a row of double dug, you know, heavily fertilized plants right next to one that you don't touch. And all you do is put a cover crop on it or a layer of some kind of organic mulch or compost on it, and they'll perform at exactly the same level, or maybe slightly different, but you'll basically get the same harvest from both of them. But on this one, I've spent, you know, 3.5 hours digging it all out and planting, you know, fertilizers on it and doing all kinds of things. And this one, all I did was plant seeds, right? So stopping the tillage, if you can find a way to reduce it to nothing or get rid of it on your own operation, it's gonna pay off in dividends on the quality of your soil, on your water infiltration, on the amount of inputs that you need to put into the system. Obviously, chemical inputs aren't a real issue for us because we're all, you know, most of us are organic growers, but the chemical inputs that kill the microbiome need to be avoided as much as possible. And then the third one is covering the soil all the time and feeding it. So if the microbiome is fed by the root exudates of growing plants, you know, solar panels feeding the soil, then you need to have something growing on your soil as often as possible, you know, preferably all year round, feeding that soil, keeping that biome alive. So the rule of thumb would be, if you don't have something green and growing, you should at least have the remains of that thing decomposing on the surface, protecting the soil, and keeping those organisms fed until which time you can get something else growing in there. This is actually a picture of Westport Commons the first year I cover cropped it, just to kick the system off. And, you know, I think I used a 20 species mix in there, which is on this end of the field that I'm standing on. It was just a mix of sunflower and pearl millet, but in the middle there's 20 species. because the diversity of species puts a diversity of root exudates, which feeds a diversity of microorganisms, you know, so diverse systems are more stable. But when you're driving past a cornfield at the end of the summer and they've harvested it and you just see bare soil, that's eroding away. All of the microorganisms in that soil are dying. You know, that soil is becoming compacted because it's not, nobody's in there putting together those soil aggregates, you know. So cover cropping, feeding the soil, keeping things covering the soil is key. I put that picture in there twice. I guess this is just some, I don't know, I might have copied too many slides here, but these are just some combinations of plants that I had at Westport. We grazed it with cattle. That, you know, again, when you're doing a market garden, grazing animals on it isn't really, it doesn't always make the most sense, but the last key in that organismal chain that cycles nutrients is the grazer. And when you have grazing animals interacting with your cover crops, it really does change the game as far as, you know, inoculations of organisms and things like that. And you can use the cows to reset the growing cycle by having them graze things down. You can use chickens the same way, but a lawnmower works too. So yeah, so some of these pictures you can see how the roots have penetrated, and you know, you can use different crops because of their different root structures. For example, buckwheat has very shallow, dense roots, and it works mostly on the surface, but like this collard plant on the left is sending down a taproot. The sorghum Sudan in the middle, that whole thing of soil you see behind the shovel, that's the giant root system of that huge tropical grass. And so on the surface, yeah, you see a lot of green stuff happening on the surface, and all of that becomes organic matter that feeds the soil. But don't forget, under the ground, you know, a rye plant might send its roots down 40 inches into the soil and bury all that organic matter down there. When that plant dies, all of that root becomes food for your soil. Yeah. Pearl millet, sunflower, blah, blah, blah. I don't know why all this is in here. Okay, so obviously when you're doing the cover cropping thing, it's a lot easier when you do large scale. These machines you see here are just basic seed drills like they use on any farm, but they're specifically made to drill into cover crop. And a lot of times they're laying this down with a crimper, maybe spraying it with herbicide, maybe not. And then the heavy weight of this machine is actually able to penetrate that dense surface cover and plant a seed, right? But you can't run a Jang seeder over top of that and plant into it. So it's not really realistic on a mid-sized farm to do something like that. So you have to find different solutions for how to cover crop on a market farm. And then on a small scale, like this picture is actually from my little food forest over at Manheim Park. I can go in and plant a cover crop. I can lay down leaves. I can do all kinds of things because it's just a small plot, you know, 100 by 100 feet. And get excellent results on it, but it's, you know, it's so small scale, you're not really growing enough food to make a living off. Same thing here. I can take a scythe and cut down rye and then plant tomato plants directly into it by hand on a small plot, but on a big plot, it's a little more challenging. So how do you take an acre or a half an acre and convert it into something like, I mean, I'm sure you guys have watched like Curtis and, you know, Jean-Michel and all these guys who do the market farming with your 30-inch rows and, you know, everything's tilled and tilthed and all that stuff. Like, how do you integrate cover cropping into that, or a no-till system into that, is really the challenge that you have to come up with on your own operation. And the starting point is, how do I preserve and feed that soil microbiome so it'll feed my plants and make my life easier and reduce the amount of inputs that I have to put into the soil? But how do I do that in a way that's profitable and it doesn't take up all my time, right? And I'm not going to tell you how to do that exactly. There's different solutions. One of them, like this guy, Charles Dowding, he uses finished compost as a mulch layer on top of his soil. So he'll put down 3 inches of compost, which controls the weeds just the same way that, say, leaves or cover crop residue would, but he can run a seeder right into that, or he can plant directly into that compost. So that's one solution that you can use. Missouri Organic just introduced this machine. It's a truck basically that'll blow compost or soil into somebody's raised beds for them. So here's one possibility for how to do it on a large scale operation. You know, let's say you have a 200-foot row that you want to plant carrots into. You know, you blow 3 inches of compost using this machine over top of that. That saves you the time of having to wheelbarrow it and do those sorts of things. So yeah, I guess that's where I dropped off on the slides. But you know, I guess the feeling I want to leave you with is that there are more ways to do this than just the way that everybody always did it, by, you know, pulverizing the soil and digging every year and doing the same sorts of things. And if you start to think about creating the soil microbiome and feeding it and nurturing it, you know, you may find solutions that actually grow higher quality produce, more nutrient dense produce, save you money on inputs and save you time and planting. I guess the challenge for all of us who are trying to utilize these types of systems is to find ways to make that work. So, and with that, I'll answer questions, I guess.